In the cobblestone squares of medieval European towns, while crowds gathered to witness the grim theater of public execution, few paid attention to the shadowy figures standing beside the main performer. These were not random apprentices or volunteers, but members of a hereditary caste bound by blood, duty, and social exile. The medieval executioner never worked alone. Standing in his shadow were his assistants, sons, brothers, and relatives who formed part of an intricate family hierarchy dedicated to the administration of death. These men lived in a world apart, marked from birth by their bloodline and trapped within a profession that society both demanded and despised. Their existence reveals one of medieval Europe's most disturbing social arrangements. Entire family dynasties condemned to carry out society's darkest work, generation after generation. Though legally the position of executioner was not hereditary, it may as well have been. The title passed typically from eldest son to eldest son, with other male children serving as aides or filling vacancies in nearby towns. This system created a shadow aristocracy of death, where bloodline determined destiny more surely than any royal decree. The Guillaume dynasty exemplified this grim inheritance. Beginning in 1594, when Jean Guillaume became executioner of Paris, his lineage would produce over 200 future executioners across France and neighboring countries. Sons who could not inherit the primary position became assistants, learning the craft while waiting for opportunities in smaller towns or serving as permanent subordinates to their elder brothers. Young Louis Desmarais inherited his father's title at age 10 in 1664, but the transition involved more than just transferring authority. His mother belonged to the Guillaume executioner dynasty, meaning his apprenticeship in death came from both bloodlines. Until he reached maturity, adult relatives served as his assistants and teachers, maintaining the execution schedule while preparing him for his inherited role. But the system demanded more than just one executioner per town. The complexity of medieval justice required multiple hands. Medieval executioners held the full title of Maître des Hautes et Basses Œuvres, master of high and low works. While the high works involved public executions and corporal punishments that drew crowds, the low works required constant attention and multiple personnel. Assistants managed the daily maintenance of punishment infrastructure. They maintained the stocks, pillories, and gallows that stood as permanent reminders of justice in town squares. They sharpened axes, tested ropes, and ensured that the tools of execution remained in working order. When scaffolds needed construction for special executions, assistants supervised the carpentry work, ensuring proper height and stability for maximum public visibility. The droit de havage, the right to collect predetermined quantities of goods from marketplace vendors, required multiple collectors. Assistants carried special bags through markets, allowing vendors to deposit required portions of bread, eggs, fish, and other goods without direct contact. This taxation system funded the executioner's household, but required careful organization and multiple personnel to cover all market areas systematically. The complexity of this collection system reflected medieval society's profound ambivalence toward executioners. They needed their services, but considered their touch contaminating. Medieval society viewed executioners and their assistants as sources of moral and physical contamination. This belief created elaborate protocols that governed every aspect of their daily interactions. Assistants learned these rules as thoroughly as they learned the mechanics of execution itself. Direct physical contact between executioners' families and ordinary citizens was strictly regulated. When collecting the droit de havage, assistants used implements that prevented their hands from touching food or coins. They carried distinctive bags and wore identifying clothing that warned others of their approach. Market vendors knew to maintain distance while fulfilling their obligations. Even executioners' children who had never participated in an execution were considered contaminated by association. It was not necessary to have actually beheaded. Merely the blood of an executioner running through your veins made you complicit. This created a caste system where assistants born into executioner families faced lifelong social isolation regardless of their personal actions or character. The contamination extended to objects and spaces. Buildings where executioner families lived were marked as tainted. Tools they used could not be shared with ordinary craftsmen. Even their money was sometimes refused by merchants who feared spiritual pollution through contact with coins touched by executioner hands. These protocols shaped every aspect of how assistants moved through medieval society, creating invisible barriers that reinforced their outsider status. The social isolation of executioner families created a unique marriage system that bound assistants into an intricate network of relationships. Daughters are executioners, married sons are executioners, and endogamy, the practice of marrying solely within a social group, only served to reinforce their outsider status. This interconnected web meant that assistants often found themselves working alongside brothers-in-law, cousins, and nephews from other executioner dynasties. Marriage alliances created professional partnerships that could span multiple towns and regions. When one executioner family needed additional help for a complex execution, they could call upon relatives from their extended network. The Sanson family exemplified this system. Following the Guillaume dynasty as executioners of Paris, they maintained their position through strategic marriages within the executioner community. Charles-Henri Sanson, who would later execute Louis XVI, worked alongside assistants who were simultaneously family members, creating a tight-knit unit bound by both blood and professional necessity. These marriage connections also facilitated the training of young assistants. Boys born into executioner families could apprentice with uncles or cousins in different cities, learning regional variations in execution techniques and punishment methods. The knowledge passed through these family networks preserved professional standards across generations. But the marriage system also ensured that escape from the profession remained nearly impossible. Becoming an executioner's assistant required extensive preparation that began in childhood. Sons born into these families underwent systematic education in both the technical and ceremonial aspects of their inherited profession. Physical training emphasized strength and precision. Assistants needed to restrain struggling prisoners, operate complex machinery like breaking wheels, and maintain steady hands during delicate procedures. They practiced with weighted training tools, building the muscle memory required for swift, clean executions that satisfied public expectations. Knowledge of anatomy was essential. Assistants learned the precise locations for sword strikes, the proper angles for beheading, and the physics of hanging. This medical knowledge helped ensure that executions proceeded efficiently, minimizing suffering while maintaining the spectacle that medieval justice demanded. Ceremonial protocols required equal attention. Assistants learned the proper timing for different phases of public executions, the traditional phrases spoken during proceedings, and the symbolic gestures that marked transitions between preparation, execution, and aftermath. They studied the specific customs of their region, understanding how local traditions shaped the execution ritual. Legal knowledge formed another crucial component. Assistants needed to understand different categories of crimes and their corresponding punishments, the proper procedures for handling noble versus common prisoners, and the documentation required for each execution. They learned to read death warrants and understand the legal protections that shielded them from murder charges. This comprehensive education created highly skilled specialists whose expertise extended far beyond the simple act of execution. The financial structure of medieval execution created a complex economy that required careful management by assistants. Beyond the dramatic public executions, executioner families controlled multiple revenue streams that demanded constant attention and specialized knowledge. Assistants managed the collection and processing of goods seized through droit de havage. They organized storage systems for perishable items, arranged sales of surplus goods, and maintained records of collected taxes. This required basic accounting skills and knowledge of market prices to maximize the family's income from their unique taxation privileges. The low works provided additional profitable opportunities. Assistants supervised the collection and processing of animal carcasses, extracting valuable materials like leather, bones, and fat for sale to craftsmen and manufacturers. They managed contracts with tanners, candle makers, and other artisans who needed these raw materials but preferred to avoid direct dealing with executioner families. Property management formed another income source. Executioner families often owned buildings in less desirable parts of towns, renting space to other social outcasts like prostitutes, vagrants, and petty criminals. Assistants collected rents, maintained these properties, and dealt with the practical challenges of managing tenants who existed on society's margins. Gaming houses provided additional revenue when local authorities permitted them. Assistants learned to operate dice games, card tables, and other gambling activities while navigating the complex legal boundaries that surrounded these enterprises. They needed skills in crowd management, basic mathematics for calculating odds and winnings, and the diplomatic abilities required to handle disputes among customers. These diverse revenue streams created wealth that often exceeded what ordinary craftsmen could achieve, but the money came with invisible costs. Every public execution required careful choreography involving multiple participants. Assistants played crucial supporting roles in these elaborate performances that served both legal and social functions in medieval communities. Preparation began days before the actual execution. Assistants coordinated with local authorities to arrange crowd control, constructed or repaired scaffolding, and prepared the condemned prisoner for their final appearance. They managed the prisoner's clothing, ensuring appropriate dress for the public spectacle while attending to basic needs during the final imprisonment period. On execution day, assistants controlled the ritual timing. They led the condemned through the ceremonial procession from prison to execution site, managing crowd interactions and maintaining the solemn atmosphere that medieval justice required. They positioned the prisoner correctly on the scaffold, managed any final statements or religious ceremonies, and ensured that the execution proceeded according to established protocols. Post-execution responsibilities included body disposal, scaffold cleanup, and crowd dispersal. Assistants removed the corpse according to family instructions or legal requirements, cleaned blood and other materials from the execution site, and dismantled temporary structures. They collected any personal effects and managed their distribution according to legal specifications. The public nature of these performances meant that assistants worked under intense scrutinization. Any mistakes or deviations from expected procedures could trigger crowd unrest or official sanctions. They needed to maintain professional composure while participating in activities that ordinary people found disturbing and morally complex. These performances reinforced the social boundaries that separated executioner families from the rest of medieval society. Medieval execution required specialized equipment that assistants maintained, operated, and continually improved. This technical knowledge distinguished professional executioners from amateur killers and reflected the period's emphasis on systematic regulated justice. Sword maintenance demanded particular expertise. Assistants learned to sharpen blades to precise angles, balance weight distribution for optimal cutting efficiency, and repair damage from repeated use. They understood metallurgy principles that affected blade performance and worked with blacksmiths to commission specialized weapons designed for execution purposes. Rope preparation involved complex technical skills. Different types of hanging required specific rope materials, thicknesses, and knotting techniques. Assistants learned to calculate proper rope lengths based on prisoner weight and height, ensuring quick death while avoiding decapitation or prolonged strangulation that could upset watching crowds. Breaking wheels, stocks, and other punishment devices required regular maintenance and skilled operation. Assistants repaired wooden components, replaced metal fittings, and calibrated mechanisms to deliver prescribed levels of pain and restraint. They learned to operate these devices efficiently while maintaining the precise control that differentiated legal punishment from random violence. Innovation occurred within traditional boundaries. Assistants developed techniques for managing difficult prisoners, improved methods for crowd control during executions, and refined procedures that reduced mess and increased efficiency. These improvements passed through the hereditary network, gradually standardizing practices across different regions and executioner families. The technical expertise required for these tools reflected medieval society's commitment to systematic, regulated approaches to justice and punishment. Executioner assistants needed to understand significant regional differences in execution methods, legal procedures, and social customs. This knowledge became crucial as families spread across different territories and assistants moved between towns to serve various executioner dynasties. Northern European regions favored different execution methods than Mediterranean areas. Assistants working in Germanic territories learned techniques for sword-based executions that differed substantially from hanging procedures common in England or France. They needed to understand how climate affected rope performance, how different wood types influenced scaffold construction, and how regional weapon preferences shaped execution protocols. Legal variations created additional complexity. Some regions required specific procedures for noble versus common criminals, while others maintained different protocols for various categories of crime. Assistants learned the documentation requirements, witness procedures, and ceremonial elements that satisfied local legal traditions while maintaining the professional standards expected of executioner families. Religious differences influenced execution practices in subtle but important ways. Catholic regions maintained different customs regarding final confession and spiritual preparation than Protestant areas. Assistants needed to coordinate with local clergy, understand appropriate religious protocols, and manage the interaction between secular punishment and spiritual concerns. Economic arrangements varied significantly between territories. The droit de havage functioned differently across regions, with some areas allowing more extensive taxation privileges while others restricted executioner families to specific revenue sources. Assistants learned to navigate these economic systems, maximizing family income while avoiding conflicts with local merchants and authorities. These regional variations required adaptability and extensive knowledge that distinguish experienced assistants from novices still learning their inherited profession. The hereditary nature of execution work created a permanent underclass within medieval European society. Assistants born into executioner families faced lifelong exclusion from normal social relationships, religious participation, and economic opportunities available to other citizens. Church attendance presented particular challenges. While executioner families maintained Christian faith, many parishes restricted their participation in communal worship. Assistants often sat in designated areas, received communion separately, or attended services at specific times to avoid contact with ordinary parishioners. Some churches refused burial in consecrated ground, forcing executioner families to maintain separate cemeteries. Guild membership remained impossible for most executioner family members. Craft guilds excluded anyone connected to execution work, preventing assistants from learning alternative trades or establishing legitimate businesses outside their inherited profession. This exclusion reinforced the hereditary nature of execution work by eliminating escape routes from the profession. Housing restrictions forced executioner families into specific neighborhoods or isolated properties. Landlords often refused to rent to anyone connected with execution work, while neighbors frequently petitioned authorities to prevent executioner families from moving into their areas. These restrictions created unofficial ghettos where multiple executioner families lived in close proximity. Legal protections remained limited despite the essential nature of their work. While executioners held official appointments that provided some protection from criminal charges related to their duties, their families enjoyed fewer legal safeguards. Assistants could face harassment, property damage, and violence with limited recourse through normal legal channels. The social isolation created unique psychological pressures that shaped the character and worldview of medieval executioner families. The hereditary system of execution assistants began declining in the late medieval period as political and social changes transformed European justice systems. Professional standards, bureaucratic efficiency, and humanitarian concerns gradually replaced the traditional family-based approach to administering death. Centralized government administration reduced the autonomy of local executioner families. Royal authorities began appointing executioners based on competence rather than heredity, breaking the generational chains that had bound families to the profession. Professional training programs replaced family apprenticeships, allowing outsiders to enter the field while providing escape routes for those born into executioner dynasties. Religious reforms influenced attitudes toward execution and the families who performed it. Protestant emphasis on individual salvation rather than collective contamination began undermining the theological basis for treating executioner families as permanently tainted. Catholic Counter-Reformation similarly emphasized personal responsibility over hereditary guilt, gradually reducing the social stigma attached to executioner bloodlines. Economic changes eliminated many traditional revenue sources. The droit de havage disappeared as market systems modernized and taxation became more centralized. Urban growth and improved sanitation reduced demand for the low works that had provided steady income for executioner families. Professional guilds began accepting some former executioner family members, creating alternative economic opportunities. The spectacular public executions that had defined medieval justice gave way to more private, bureaucratic approaches to capital punishment. This transformation reduced the ceremonial aspects of execution work while emphasizing efficiency and professionalism over hereditary tradition and family-based expertise. The medieval system of hereditary execution assistants reveals uncomfortable truths about how societies organize necessary but morally problematic work. By creating permanent castes to handle death, medieval European communities simultaneously ensured professional competence while maintaining psychological distance from the violence their justice system required. They developed sophisticated skills while being denied opportunities to use those abilities in other contexts. They accumulated wealth while being excluded from the social recognition that normally accompanied economic success. Their legacy extends beyond the scaffolds and execution squares where they worked. The hereditary principle that bound generation after generation to this profession demonstrates how social structures can trap individuals within roles that society considers essential but morally compromising. The elaborate protocols governing their daily lives reveal the psychological mechanisms that communities use to manage collective guilt about sanctioned violence. In the shadows of medieval town squares, these assistants carried out society's darkest necessities while bearing the weight of collective moral compromise. Their hidden lives illuminate the complex relationships between justice, social order, and individual sacrifice that continue to shape how communities organize difficult but necessary work. They remind us that behind every system of justice stand real individuals whose lives are shaped by the roles society assigns them, regardless of their personal choices or moral character. Their story ends not with dramatic transformation, but with quiet displacement, as changing times eventually release their descendants from the inherited burden of administering death for a society that needed their services but could never fully accept their humanity.